Hi, friends. Um, Recently I did another video that had the topic of social construction. It was be the change, you want to see in the world and how that relates to the idea of social construction. And so in that video, I really focused on, the individual change. Because I was talking about be the change that you want to see in the world. So how a person themselves as an individual wakes up every morning and recreates culture. Because ultimately the culture gets remade every day as people um, it's constructed, it's socially constructed every day, the socially constructed aspects of culture, that is. And, so I think that's, a really fun topic to think about. And, but it's only really part of the picture. So I wanted to touch base about another aspect of social construction, and that's social construction is sort of more at a macro level, and that's how through well, we could talk about institutions and things like this, but what I really wanted to talk about was more still sticking with the cultural aspect of art, so movies and this sort of thing. Not so much music. Specifically, I was going to chat a bit about movies and how, this part of our culture gets made and consumed in modern, the modern everyday life, but it stays around. So it stays around for years and decades, and can be hundreds of years actually, if we're talking about books and music and things like this. So, but I think there's really a couple of really good illustrations about this, about how it can be somewhat controversial or problematic, and it might not even actually hold us back as a culture, since we have these forms of art now, like movies, we've only had those for about 100 years. So, it sort of, I guess, remains to be seen how those age through time as the culture itself changes. So the first movie that I wanted to bring up as a topic is actually the movie Gone with the Wind. So, usually in my talks, I really try to keep my talks universal, meaning not specific to the United States, which is where I'm from. I like to try to have more of a universalist outlook on things. But I think Gone with the Wind is an American movie that has had a place in the icon, at least in the United States, very high as far as a cultural sort of touchstone. So this is more specific to the U.S. than I would think be more universal, but it has universal aspects too. So by cultural touchstone, I mean Gone with the Wind is a movie that most people, at least since it came out in 1939, it came out, have seen it or they are aware of it. It is a movie that has pervaded the culture to the point that people are familiar with it on a level different than just seeing the movie. I think, especially it might be a little less so now, but definitely throughout the 20th century, it was this way as I was growing up. The late 20th century. But now, as the culture has slowly been changing, and now there is somewhat controversial among large groups of people. African Americans interpret this movie much differently, and also we could say Southerners Southerners in the United States have used this movie, has become sort of a cultural touchstone for them, which has idealized a myth of the pre-Civil War South, the slaveholding South, as sort of this genteel place that was all destroyed by the aggressive North. So it has helped. This movie has actually helped to reproduce this culture, reproduce the culture that we've had, I think, ever since 1939. It's actually been one of those things, since it came out in 1939, it's been one of those things that helps actually reinforce the dominant cultural worldview, which was sort of a retelling of the story of the South, to be probably a little more genteel and a little less cruel than it actually was, since it was slaveholding and most of the South was not this sort of big house, big plantation houses, and so on. And the Southerners are portrayed as more or less, noble people. Even Rhett Butler who is sort of war privateer. At the end of it's sort of after Atlanta falls, I think he becomes ennobled by the war and becomes a noble person. So I think this was part of the appeal for the of the movie. It was sort of this remaking of culture. So whether or not that's a historically accurate view of the South and the Civil War is very debatable. And on the other hand, it's remade this idea of the blacks that are in the movie, the slaves that are in the movie. They're actually slaves, Mammy and Prissy, and they are, they're sort of complicit in their bondage, I guess you could say. They're very content with their owners and love them, and their owners love them, and so it's sort of like this family thing. So that's the cultures, that's sort of, I think that this movie has helped to reinforce this idea over time, and probably helped reinforce notions of segregation that were in place when the movie came out and continued on for many more years after this movie came out. So I think that, that's a really good, Gone with the Wind is a really good illustration of how a piece of a cultural artifact like this movie actually, since it continues to exist in time, it helps reinforce and helps remake the culture every day. So it helps with the social construction. When the culture is socially reconstructed on a daily basis, this movie's there to back up the dominant view. And I'll talk briefly about another aspect of movies, and TV, which is smoking. And this one's a little more universal, so not quite specific to the U.S., but smoking was recognized actually by anti-smoking activists, that portraying smoking as cool and portraying smoking in movies and in TV and this sort of culture, popular culture, was actually helping to recreate and reinforce youth smoking. And, I think it probably still does to a degree, because I think probably actually youth today probably still think that smoking's somewhat cool, even though everybody knows at this point that it is a deadly thing to do. But the anti-smoking activists recognize that putting smoking in these situations where the characters smoke and it actually enhances the quote unquote coolness of their character, was actually helping to, we could use this socially construct and socially reconstruct this notion of smoking as a cool thing to do. So I think that that's very illustrative of how social construction has been recognized by people as far as the presence in movies. What's shown in movies and what gets reproduced in society is very known and can be logically evaluated, I guess is a good way to put that. Maybe it is. So the last kind of movie I wanted to bring up is on a different topic, and I think I may in other videos have brought up this movie before because it bothered me so much when I actually saw it. And this movie is actually Julie and Julia, that came out a few years ago, that was about the story of this girl, this woman that was she blogged about making the entire recipe book of Julia Child. And so it was kind of a dual story in there. And in one scene, there is a scene where she's making lobster, and the lobster is a live lobster, and she tries to put it in the boiling water, and it tries to get out, obviously, because it's boiling alive. And the audience, that's actually a comedic point in the movie. And the audience, when I saw the movie, actually laughed. And it was supposed to be funny, because she's freaking out because the lobster's trying to get out of this boiling thing. She's trying to put the lid on it. So this reinforces the othering, though, of animals, So this is this sort of scene, which is a comic scene of animal cruelty, actually. But yet it reinforces in the culture that there's a separation, a psychological separation between the suffering of the lobster, of the animal, and this woman trying to have this kind of like clumsy way to keep the lid on, and freaking out over the lobster trying to get out. That was considered funny. So, but it reinforces that dominant cultural idea that this is not animal cruelty, that this is funny. When in actuality, it actually, obviously it's animal cruelty whenever you're dropping a sentient being into boiling water that knows how to feel pain and knows suffering. So I wanted to bring those three issues up because I think that it's really interesting to think of books and movies, and what I've been thinking about a lot, and I don't have a solution, is at what point do we turn a corner and say this movie and see the movie in a different way? So I think Gone with the Wind may be a good one for me to watch as the years come, see how it evolves in the next few years, to see if it the cultural interpretation of Gone with the Wind undergoes a metamorphosis. And it may not be the first movie to do so. I know that Birth of a Nation kind of has done this. This was one of the very, very first movies, which I didn't discuss, but it had racial elements and was sympathetic, actually, to the Ku Klux Klan back in, I think this movie came out in like 1915 or something, so it's been 100 years or so. So it is one that now is interpreted differently. It was a huge hit when it came out, and now it's interpreted through this lens of racism now. So it has ceased to transmit its ceased to be a building block for racism in the social construction of our culture, I think. Okay, well, that's all I wanted to say. I hope that didn't ramble too much because, I had that on my mind today, and I thought, it's kind of a continuation of that other recent video that I did about social construction and the individual change, and this is sort of on more of a macro level, so I hope it made a little bit of sense and maybe was a little bit interesting, and it might just have been a big ramble, in which case, can't help that. But anyway, until next time, take care. Bye.